Get this man out of my building before he scares off a single donor." The words cut clean through the string of polite laughter near the champagne table, and for a second the whole lobby of Cedar Hill Regional held still, the way a room does when somebody says the quiet part at full volume. A man in a charcoal suit with a folded program in his fist was pointing across the marble at an old black man in a gray sport coat that had been pressed so many times the lapels had gone soft. The old man wasn't moving. He just stood there with a small velvet box cupped in both hands, the way you'd hold a bird with a hurt wing. What nobody in that lobby knew yet, not the donors, not the board, not the man doing the pointing, was that the marble under their $1,000 shoes had been paid for out of that old man's checkbook. The crystal chandelier overhead, the glass atrium, the bronze letters being unveiled in 40 minutes on the wall of the new children's wing, all of it traced back, dollar by quiet dollar, to the man being escorted toward the door like a stain somebody wanted gone before the photographer arrived. That administrator had just ordered security to drag out the one person in the building, whose name the hospital had been begging to put on the wall for 9 years. 7 hours earlier, Augustus Holloway woke up at 4:40 in the morning, the way he had every morning since he was 19 years old. He didn't need the alarm. His body still ran on hospital shifts that had ended decades ago. He lay there a minute in the dark, listening to the radiator tick and the early bus hiss to a stop 2 blocks over, and then he got up, because lying in bed had never once solved a single thing for him. His apartment was on the 2nd floor of a brick walk-up on the east side. 3 rooms and a kitchen you could touch both walls of at the same time. He'd lived there 41 years. He could have lived anywhere. He'd had the means to live anywhere for a long time now. But the staircase still creaked on the 4th step the same way it had the night he'd carried Della up it as a bride. And a man doesn't trade away a sound like that just because he can afford a quieter house. He put the coffee on. While it dripped, he stood at the ironing board in his undershirt and pressed the gray sport coat one more time. Slow, the iron hissing, the steam curling up past a window still black with night. He didn't own a nicer coat. He owned a closet full of coats other men would have killed for, suits cut by a tailor in a city he flew to twice a year, but those weren't his. Those belonged to the man the board members thought they were dealing with. This gray coat was his. It was what he wore to church and to funerals, and to the cemetery on the 3rd Sunday of every month. And tonight it was what he was going to wear to watch them put his wife's name on a building. On the kitchen table sat a small framed photograph in the velvet box. The photograph was 46 years old. A young woman in a white nurse's cap, laughing at something just off camera, one hand pressed to her chest, like the laugh had caught her by surprise. Della Holloway, RN, 23 years old, 8 months before he married her. She'd worked the pediatric ward at this same hospital back when it was half the size and twice as honest, back when he'd pushed a mop down those same halls at night. And she'd leave him notes taped to the supply closet door. "You missed a spot by room 214. Also, you're handsome. Also, bring me coffee." He still had every note. They were in a shoebox in the closet, and he had read them so many times the creases had gone furry. The velvet box held her nursing pin, gold, small, a little lamp engraved on the face of it, worn smooth on one edge from 40 years of her thumb. She'd given it to him in the hospital the last week of her life, pressed it into his palm with a hand that didn't have much grip left in it, and told him to do something good with it someday. Not something big, something good. There was a difference, she said, and he'd spent every year since trying to live inside that difference. He wrapped the box in a clean handkerchief and put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, and he looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and tugged his collar straight. "Well, Dell," he said to nobody, "they finally got it built." By the time the car came for him, a plain sedan, a driver named Rosa, who'd been bringing him to his doctor appointments for years and didn't know the first thing about his money. The sun was already going down gold over the river. The hospital sat up on the rise on the south side, all new glass now, lit up like a cathedral. Cedar Hill Regional. He remembered when it was just a sooty old building with a leaking roof and a children's ward where the heat barely reached. He remembered carrying a space heater up to room 211 himself one January night because a 6-year-old with pneumonia was shivering and the radiator had quit. Nobody had told him to. He'd just done it. That was the whole story of his life, really. Nobody told him to, and he did it anyway. Inside, the Gala was already humming. The new atrium soared 3 stories, white roses everywhere, a harpist in the corner, waiters in black ties, threading through clusters of people who all seemed to know one another and had clearly never once in their lives wondered whether the lights would stay on. There was a champagne tower near the entrance, glass stacked on glass, catching the chandelier and throwing it back in 100 pieces. Augustus stood just inside the doors and let it wash over him for a second, and what he felt wasn't pride. It was something more like ache. Della would have hated the roses. All that money on flowers, that'll be in a dumpster by Sunday, she'd have said. You know what a dumpster of money looks like to a sick kid's mama? It looks like a bill she can't pay. She'd have wanted the money in the wing itself, in the beds and the nurses and the families who couldn't afford the parking. And that was exactly where most of it had gone, because he'd made sure of it, every year, quietly, through a foundation with a name that didn't sound like anything, and a lawyer who knew how to keep a secret. A young waiter offered him a flute of champagne. He smiled and said, "No thank you, son," and the boy smiled back and moved on. And that small kindness was the last one Augustus Holloway would receive in that lobby for a while. Because that was when Spencer Caldwell saw him. Spencer Caldwell was 43, interim chief administrator of Cedar Hill Regional, and a man who had spent his entire career learning the precise difference between people who could help him and people who could not. He'd come up through development, through donor cultivation, through the delicate art of making rich people feel generous, and he had a sense for a room, the way a shark has a sense for a current. He'd been working that room all evening. A hand on this shoulder, a low laugh at that joke, a whisper in the ear of the Pruitt Foundation people about naming opportunities. And his evening was going beautifully, right up until he turned and saw, standing near his champagne tower in front of 2 photographers, and the entire board, an old man in a worn-out coat clutching a handkerchief like a church usher who'd wandered in off the bus. To Spencer, the man was a problem, a visual, a wrong note. He didn't see Augustus Holloway. He saw optics. He saw a vagrant who'd slipped past security, the kind of human being his entire professional instinct had trained him to relocate quickly and quietly, before anyone with a checkbook noticed. He crossed the marble fast, his smile already arranged into something tight and managerial, and his deputy Brett Connolly fell in behind him because Brett went everywhere. Spencer went, the way a smaller fish follows a bigger one through cloudy water. "Sir." Spencer stopped a foot too close, the way men do when they want to use their size. "Sir, this is a private event. I'm going to need you to come with me." Augustus looked up at him, calm, old eyes that had seen a great many men in expensive suits and learned not to be impressed by the suit. "I have an invitation," he said. His voice was low and even and entirely unbothered, and that somehow made Spencer angrier than shouting would have. "I'm sure you think you do." Spencer's eyes went down the gray coat and back up the soft lapels, the church shoes polished thin, the handkerchief. "Did somebody let you in the side door? You can't be in here. There's a shelter on Dell Avenue. They serve dinner till 8. I can have someone walk you down." He said it loud enough that a few heads turned, loud enough to perform it. "My wife worked in this building 30 years, Augustus said. I came to see them put her name up." Spencer laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was amused. "Right, of course she did." He turned to Brett. "Get security now, quietly." Then back to the old man, dropping his voice to the flat tone people use on dogs. "Sir, you're embarrassing yourself. Let's not do this in front of everyone." 2 security guards came over, big men in dark suits with earpieces. The older one put a hand on Augustus's shoulder, not rough but firm, the kind of grip that means the decision's already made. But the younger one, he couldn't have been 25, looked at the old man's face for a second too long, saw something in it that didn't fit the story he was being told. A stillness, a dignity that doesn't come off a park bench. "Sir," the young guard said, low, just to Spencer. "Maybe we ought to check the guest list first. He says he's got an." "I didn't ask you to check anything." Spencer didn't even look at him. "I asked you to walk him out. Do your job or I'll find a guard who can." The older guard's hand tightened. "Come on now," he said to Augustus, not unkindly. "Let's go." And here is the part people always remember when they tell this story afterward. Augustus Holloway didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a phone, didn't say the one sentence that would have ended the whole thing in 2 seconds flat. He looked at Spencer Caldwell for a long, quiet moment, the way you look at a man you've already decided something about. Then he nodded, once, mostly to himself, and turned toward the doors. He pressed the handkerchief tighter against his chest, over the pin, over his heart, and he walked, his thin-soled shoes loud on the marble in a lobby that had gone half-silent watching him go. Behind him, Brett Connolly muttered something to a cluster of younger staff near the bar, and one of them laughed. And the sound of it followed Augustus out the door like a stone skipping across water. He didn't go far. He sat down on a stone bench in the courtyard, under a young maple the landscapers had planted last spring. And he set the velvet box on his knee and unwrapped the handkerchief and looked at the little gold lamp until his breathing settled. He wasn't crying. People who didn't know him sometimes mistook that stillness for not caring. It was the opposite. It was a man holding something so heavy that any motion at all might spill it. Up on the second floor, in a curtained alcove off the residence lounge, a young doctor named Imani Holloway was scrubbing the last of a 12-hour shift off her hands and trying to decide whether she had the energy to stop by the Gala downstairs for the 10 minutes of family loyalty she'd promised her grandfather she'd manage. Imani was 28, 2 years into her pediatrics residency at the very hospital her grandmother had worked in before Imani was born, and she had walked these halls her whole life, the way other kids knew their backyard. She'd grown up on the stories, the space heater, the notes in the supply closet, the gold pin. Half the reason she'd gone into medicine at all was the woman in that photograph she'd never gotten to meet. Her phone buzzed against the sink. A text from another resident, one of her friends working the Gala as a volunteer. "Imani, is your grandpa here? In a gray jacket?" Security just walked an old man out the front. Caldwell was being so nasty about it. I think it was him. She read it once. She read it again, slower, the way you do when the words won't arrange themselves into something that can be true. Then, she dropped the paper towel, and she ran. She came down the back stairwell 2 at a time, badge swinging, past the supply closets and the linen carts, past room 214 with its old number plate they'd kept when they renovated, and she hit the lobby moving so fast a waiter had to pull his tray up out of her way. Spencer Caldwell was over by the bar now, easy again, telling the Pruitt people a story with his hands. The unpleasantness already filed away in the part of his mind where he kept things that didn't matter. "Where is he?" Imani's voice cut across the harp. "Where did they take him?" Spencer turned, the polished smile coming up automatic. "I'm sorry, my grandfather. You had security walk an old man out of here 20 minutes ago. Gray coat, where is he?" A flicker then. Spencer was good at his job, and his job was reading rooms, and the room had just shifted under him in a way he didn't like. He recovered fast. "Dr. Holloway, is it?" There was a confused gentleman who wandered in. We handled it gently, I assure you, there's no need to. Confused. Imani's voice didn't go up. It went down, which was worse. "That man raised me. He pays the property tax on the parking structure you walked through tonight. You want to tell me again how confused he was?" A few people had stopped talking. Spencer felt it. His smile fought to hold its shape. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm sure your grandfather is a lovely man. But this is a major donor event, and appearances." "Appearances." She laughed, one hard breath of it, and there were tears standing in her eyes, but her voice never shook. "You threw my grandmother's husband out of the building they're naming after my grandmother. Tonight. On this night." She shook her head slowly. "You have no idea what you just did. You don't even know who he is." "I know enough," Spencer said, and it was the worst sentence he'd say all night, because he believed it. I know a man who couldn't put on a decent jacket for an event like this. That tells me everything I need to know. No. Imani was already turning toward the doors. It doesn't tell you one single thing. She found him on the bench under the maple, the box open on his knee, and her whole body came apart at the sight of him. She crossed the courtyard and dropped down beside him and put her arms around his neck. And into his shoulder she said, "Grandpa, Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Hey now." He brought one arm up around her, the other hand still cupping the box so it wouldn't fall. "Hey, none of that. It's not okay. What he did, it's not. I know it isn't." He pulled back enough to look at her, and he wiped under her eye with his thumb the way he'd done since she was 4 years old and skinned her knees on the church steps. "I know exactly what it isn't, baby. Sit with me a minute." So she sat. And the two of them were quiet under that little tree, while inside the building they'd built the harpist played on. And the donors drank, and a man named Spencer Caldwell straightened his cuffs and decided the unpleasantness was behind him. Then Augustus took out his phone. It was an old phone. He thumbed through it slowly, and Imani, leaning against him, caught a glimpse of the names as they scrolled past, and even through her tears something in her went still, because she knew some of those names. Senators. A man whose foundation had a wing at a hospital in another state. The kind of names that don't usually live in an old flip-up phone in a worn coat pocket. He didn't call any of them. He called one number and he held the phone to his ear, and when somebody picked up, he said, "Yasmin, it's Gus." A pause. The faint shape of a woman's voice on the other end. "No, I'm fine. I'm out front, on the bench by that new tree." A pause. Something in his face, not anger. Sorrow maybe, and underneath it the smallest seam of something harder. He did just about what you'd expect when he thought nobody was looking. Had me walked out the door. Another pause, longer. Imani watched her grandfather's jaw work once. "No, I don't want a scene, Yas. I never wanted a scene. But I think it's time he met me properly. Come down, and bring the folder." He closed the phone and slid it back into his pocket and looked up at the lit-up glass of the building. And for the first time all night, something settled across his face that Imani had only seen a handful of times in her life. It was the look he got right before he made a decision he'd already made a long time ago and was only now deciding to act on. "Grandpa," she whispered. "Who was that?" He took her hand. "That," he said, "was the only person in that building who knows my whole name." He almost smiled. "I gave him exactly what he asked for, baby. He asked to find out who I am." What Spencer Caldwell did not know, what nobody in that lobby knew, except the woman now walking fast toward the elevator on the 3rd floor with a leather folder under her arm, was the rest of it. Augustus Holloway had not always been a man with a foundation. 50 years ago, he'd been a janitor at this hospital, the night shift, pushing a mop down halls that smelled of bleach and grief. And he'd fallen in love with a pediatric nurse who left him notes on the supply closet door. When Della got sick, the first time, years before the time that took her, the bills had nearly drowned them. He'd watched what a medical bill could do to a working family from the inside, from the wrong side of the billing window, and he had promised himself, in the worst week of his life, that if he ever got out from under it, he would spend the rest of his days making sure nobody else got pulled down the same hole. He got out from under it the hard way. He took the small disability settlement from a back injury, and instead of spending it, he bought a single beat-up box truck and started hauling medical supplies between clinics that the big distributors didn't think were worth the drive. He drove the routes himself, 16 hours a day, sleeping in the cab. The clinics he served were the small ones, the poor ones, the rural ones, and the inner-city ones, and he served them so reliably and so cheaply that within 5 years he had 4 trucks, and within 15 he had a fleet, and within 30 the company he'd started in a rented garage on the east side had become Meridian Health Logistics, a supply chain firm that moved medicine and equipment to half the hospitals on the eastern seaboard. He was the founder. He was the majority owner. He was, on paper, in filings that no hospital administrator would ever bother to read, a very wealthy man. When Della died, He stepped back from the company and gave the running of it to people he trusted. And he took the fortune it threw off every year and he poured it, quietly, through a foundation, into the kinds of places that had nearly broken them. Children's wings, charity, care funds, programs that paid the parking and the co-pays and the things insurance pretended weren't real. He never let his name on anything, not once. The wing being dedicated tonight, he'd insisted carry her name and not his. The Della Holloway Children's Pavilion, and he'd structured the gift so carefully through the foundation that almost no one at Cedar Hill knew the donor was a person at all, let alone an old man in a gray coat. Almost no one. Dr. Yasmin Okonkwo knew. Yasmin Okonkwo was the president and chief executive of Cedar Hill Regional, and 9 years ago, when the hospital was 11 months from closing its doors, a foundation nobody had heard of had wired in the money that saved it, on one condition, that the children's wing be built and named for a nurse, and that the donor's identity stay buried. She had met the man behind the foundation exactly twice, both times in a lawyer's office, and she had come out of those meetings, understanding that the quietest man she had ever sat across from owned more of her hospital's future than her entire board combined. She had spent 9 years protecting his secret. She was not going to let a man like Spencer Caldwell spend it for him. The harp had just finished a piece, and the floor manager was gathering people toward the wall, where the bronze letters waited under a velvet drape, when the front doors of the atrium swung open. Not gently, not the slow professional glide the staff had practiced for arriving donors, but all the way open, fast, like somebody meant it. Dr. Yasmin Okonkwo walked in alone. Tall, deliberate, a deep green suit that the chandelier liked, the leather folder flat against her side. She did not look left. She did not look right. She walked straight up the center of the marble the way a person walks through a room she has decided she has finished being patient in. It started with one whisper near the door. "Is that? That's Dr. Okonkwo." Then the next cluster. "The CEO's here." Then it rolled outward across the atrium the way a dropped stone moves through still water. And by the time she was halfway across the floor, the harpist had stopped without being told. And 200 people had turned to watch their hospital's president cross the room with a face nobody had ever seen her wear at a fundraiser. Spencer Caldwell saw her coming, and his whole body recalibrated in an instant. The CEO, here, at his event. He'd been managing up his entire career, and this was the apex of it, the boss appearing at the moment of his triumph, and his pulse jumped with a feeling he mistook completely for good fortune. He set down his glass, shot his cuffs, fixed his best meeting room smile to his face, and stepped forward with his hand already extended. "Dr. Okonkwo, what a wonderful surprise. We've had a tremendous turnout. The Pruitt people are very close. I think we're going to clear our number for thee." Yasmin Okonkwo did not take his hand. She stopped in front of him and let his hand hang there in the air between them, and the silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3, and every person in the atrium understood, in that suspended hand, that something was very wrong. "Where is he?" she said. Spencer's smile flickered. "I'm sorry. Where is who?" "The man your security removed from this building 40 minutes ago." Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't need loud. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the champagne tower fizz. Graycoat, carrying a small box. "Where is he, Spencer?" "That." Spencer's hand finally dropped. "There was a gentleman who. He wasn't on the list. He wasn't dressed for. I handled a security situation. I don't see what. You handled it." Yasmin opened the leather folder. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew every page. "I'm going to tell you what you handled, and I'm going to do it in front of these people, because you did it in front of these people." She turned slightly, so her voice carried to the board members frozen by the velvet drape. "The man you called a vagrant, the man you offered to walk to a shelter, the man you had 2 guards drag out of his own wife's dedication." She let it land. "His name is Augustus Holloway. His wife, Della Holloway, was a pediatric nurse in this hospital for 30 years. And that," she lifted one hand toward the draped wall, "is her name under that velvet on that wall. Because 9 years ago, when this hospital was 4 payrolls from closing forever, His foundation wrote the check that kept the lights on. Not one check every year since. He is the reason you have a building to throw a party in tonight, Spencer. He is the reason any of us are employed. You could hear people breathing. He has asked for nothing in 9 years, Yasmin went on, quieter now, which somehow carried further. No plaque with his name. No seat on the board. No table at the gala. The only thing he ever asked this institution for was that we treat the people who come through our doors with dignity, no matter what they're wearing or what they can pay. She closed the folder, and the first time he walks through those doors himself, in a coat he wore to his wife's funeral, you threw him out for looking poor. She turned her body 90 degrees toward the open front doors, and she extended her right hand toward them, and she waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Augustus Holloway walked back in. Same gray coat, same worn shoes, same velvet box, held now in one hand against his chest. But he didn't come in the way he'd gone out. His shoulders weren't down, his eyes weren't lowered. His granddaughter walked beside him in her scrubs, with her chin up, and her hand light on his arm, and the two of them crossed that marble together, while 200 of the wealthiest people in the city stood up out of their chairs without anyone telling them to. Spencer Caldwell's face had gone the color of the marble he'd ordered. The man dragged across. "Mr. Holloway," he started, the words coming out cracked, the polish stripped right off them. "Sir, there's been a terrible, if I had known who you—" Augustus stopped in front of him. He looked at Spencer for a long moment, the same calm look he'd given him 40 minutes earlier, the look of a man who had already decided something. "If you'd known who I was," Augustus said quietly, "you'd have been kind to me. I know, that's the whole trouble with you, son." He shook his head, almost gentle. "I didn't want you to know who I was. I wanted to find out who you were, and I did." He didn't shout it, he didn't have to. He turned away from Spencer Caldwell as if the man had already stopped existing, and he walked the rest of the way across the floor to the draped wall, where Yasmin was waiting, and he took hold of the velvet cord with the hand that wasn't holding his wife's pin, and he looked back once at Amani, who was crying now, and not bothering to hide it, and he pulled. The drape came down. Bronze letters caught the chandelier and threw it back warm across the whole silent room. The Della Halalai Children's Pavilion, and below it, in smaller letters he had argued with the foundation lawyers about for a week before allowing even this much. "She taught us to measure a hospital by how it treats the family that can't read the bill." Augustus stood in front of his wife's name with the little gold lamp pressed over his heart, and he didn't say anything for a while, and nobody rushed him. When he finally turned around, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "She'd have hated the roses," he said, and a sound went through the crowd that was half a laugh and half a sob. "But she'd have liked the wing." Now, people always want to know what happened after, and in this story, for once, the after was as satisfying as the moment. Spencer Caldwell was placed on administrative leave before the gala was even over, walked out a side door of the building he'd run that morning. The internal review that followed turned up 3 older complaints against him from staff he'd treated badly when he thought no one important was watching. An environmental services worker, a transport tech, a per diem nurse. All of them the kind of people Spencer hadn't bothered to be careful around. He resigned within the month, before they could finish the process. The story had gotten out by then. It always does. He took a job at a smaller institution 2 states over, and when that one read the headlines, they let him go too, and the last anyone heard he'd left healthcare entirely. Brett Connolly, who'd laughed by the bar, was reassigned, then quietly let go in the next round of cuts. Nobody at Cedar Hills spoke up to save him. The young security guard, the one who'd said maybe we ought to check the list first, got a letter. A real letter, handwritten on plain paper, from Augustus himself, thanking him for the only decent instinct in the lobby that night. 6 months later, that young man started nursing school on a scholarship from the Holloway Foundation. He works the pediatric floor of the Della Holloway Pavilion now. He says he still has the letter. Yasmin Okonkwo kept running the hospital, and the foundation's gift, no longer secret, grew. The line under Della's name became the institution's actual mission statement, printed on the wall by the admissions desk, where every frightened family can see it. Imani Holloway finished her residency at the top of her class and stayed on staff, in the building named for the grandmother she never met. She keeps the gold pin in the pocket of her white coat, every shift, every day. She says it reminds her that the most important person in any room is usually the one everybody else has decided. Doesn't matter. And Augustus Holloway went home to his brick walk-up on the east side, to the staircase that creaks on the fourth step. And he still gets up at 4:40 in the morning, and he still irons his own coat, and he still drives nowhere in a hurry. He started coming to the hospital once a month, though in person, in the gray coat. He sits in the children's ward and reads to the kids who don't have anybody there to read to them, and most of them never learn that the old man with the soft voice paid for the bed they're lying in. That's how he likes it. So, here's the part where you have to be honest with yourself for a second. Have you ever stood in a room and watched someone get looked over, talked down to, moved aside? A server, an old man, somebody in the wrong shoes and felt the wrongness of it, and said nothing, because it wasn't your business and the night was going fine? Most of us have. Most of us are the people by the bar, not the young guard who spoke up. And if you could stand in that lobby again, knowing what you know now, that you never ever actually know who's standing in front of you, that the man in the worn coat might be the one holding the whole roof up, would you do it differently? You don't have to wait to find out who someone is to treat them right. That's the part Spencer Caldwell never understood, and the part Augustus Holloway built an entire life around. The kindness you give to someone who can do nothing for you is the only kind that ever really counted. The rest is just manners. She used to leave him notes on a supply closet door. You missed a spot. Also, you're handsome. Also, bring me coffee. He still has every one of them. And the building has her name on it now, in bronze, where the families who can't read the bill walk in every single day, which is exactly, down to the letter, the good he promised her he'd do.